The slap landed wrong. Not on the cheek it was aimed at, on the arm of a woman who had stepped in front of it without thinking, without weighing the cost, without knowing whose mother she had just protected. The sound of it cracked through the marble foyer of the Conti estate, and Rosa Vega stood there, hand pressed to the side of her face, and thought, I still have 9 days until my brother's surgery. What she didn't know, what none of them in that foyer realized, was that the man standing at the top of the staircase had seen every second of it. And he had already decided that whoever had raised that hand would not use it again. Her name was Rosa Vega, 31 years old, hired 12 weeks ago through a domestic staffing agency that didn't ask questions and paid bi-weekly in cash. She cleaned the east wing of the Conti estate on Tuesdays and Fridays, managed the kitchen inventory on Thursdays, and on the days in between she told herself that keeping her head down was the same as being safe. She was wrong about that, as it turned out, but she didn't find out until the foyer. His name was Marco Conti, and by the time Rosa Vega stepped in front of his mother, she had worked in his house for 12 weeks. Without ever meeting him directly. She had seen him the way you see weather, through evidence, through effect, through the way other people moved when he was nearby. A door closing on the second floor, men in the kitchen who went quiet mid-sentence when his car pulled into the circular drive. A coat she had learned to recognize by the sound it made on the coat hook, because when that sound happened, the staff moved differently for the next 4 hours. She had $47,000 in medical debt in her name and her brother's name combined, accumulated over 16 months of the kind of illness that doesn't care what you've saved. The surgery was scheduled for the 23rd. 9 days. She had enough to cover the gap if she didn't miss a single shift between now and then. She had not planned to step in front of anything. The woman who had raised her hand was named Giulia Ferraro, and she had been the estate's head of household for 11 years before Rosa arrived. What Giulia Ferraro was not, and had never been, was a patient woman. She had managed 11 years of staff turnover by establishing early and clearly that her authority in this house was absolute and that challenges to it, however small, however accidental, were not challenges at all. They were mistakes. And mistakes, in her experience, resolved themselves quickly when they understood the cost. The cost this Tuesday morning was a missing inventory log that Rosa had filed in the wrong cabinet, because she had been working the East Wing simultaneously and had not yet learned the difference between the household files and the procurement files. It was a mistake of 3 weeks' tenure, the kind that experienced staff learned on their first month and forgot by their second. Giulia Ferraro did not frame it that way. She found Rosa in the kitchen at 7:45 and began with her voice low and precise. A catalog of failures assembled from 12 weeks of observation, delivered with the particular efficiency of someone who has been waiting for a clean excuse. Rosa listened. Her face stayed still. Her hands stayed flat on the counter. She was not thinking about the catalog. She was thinking about the surgery on the 23rd and the bi-weekly check that cleared on Fridays, and whether what was happening right now was the kind of thing that ended in termination. She didn't notice when Signora Conte appeared in the kitchen doorway. Marco Conti's mother was 73 years old and walked with a cane and had the particular quality of stillness that sometimes settles into people who have been through enough that surprises no longer register as surprising. She had come downstairs for her morning coffee. She did not intend to step into anything. She simply appeared in the doorway at the moment Giulia Ferraro's voice shifted from precision to performance, and Giulia Ferraro, without quite deciding to, redirected. The hand came up. Rosa stepped in front of it. She didn't think about why. There was a woman with a cane and a hand swinging toward her face, and Rosa Vega's body made the calculation before her mind finished the sentence. The slap caught her on the side of her left arm rather than the old woman's cheek. And it stung, and she stood there with her hand pressed to it and her face completely still. And Giulia Ferraro's expression shifted from fury to something that looked, briefly, like fear. The kitchen went silent. From the foyer, from the top of the marble staircase where he had stopped on his way down to a 7:50 meeting, Marco Conti had seen all of it. He said nothing. He went to his meeting. He did not hurry. Rosa Vega had grown up in a 3-bedroom apartment in Guadalajara with her parents and her younger brother Diego, and a wooden letter set that spelled his name above his bed, Diego, in painted pine. Slightly uneven because their father had hung them himself, and the D was a centimeter lower than the rest. Diego was 27 now, and his kidneys were failing, and the wooden letters were in a cardboard box in Rosa's apartment in Monterey Park, because she had packed them when she helped him move into the care facility and could not bring herself to leave them behind. She thought about them sometimes on the drive to the estate. She thought about them on the Tuesday morning after the foyer incident when she showed up at 7:30 because she still had 9 days until the surgery, and missing shifts was not an option regardless of what had happened in the kitchen the day before. Giulia Ferraro was not at the estate on Tuesday. Rosa didn't ask why. She collected her cleaning cart from the utility closet, noted that someone had restocked the lemon oil she'd put on the low inventory list 2 weeks ago, and went to the East Wing. She was on her knees polishing the baseboards of the library at 9:15 when she heard footsteps in the hallway, not the quick, purposeful steps of estate staff, but a slower, more deliberate sound. She stood. She kept her eyes on the baseboard. The footsteps stopped in the doorway. "You didn't call in," Marco Conti said. She turned. He was in the doorway in a suit that probably cost more than 2 months of her salary, holding a coffee cup that was not from the kitchen she'd stocked that morning, and looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. "I wasn't injured," she said. "It was my arm." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I know what it was." She turned back to the baseboard. "Giulia Ferraro has been placed on indefinite leave," he said. "HR is managing the transition. You'll deal with me directly until a replacement is vetted." Rosa kept her eyes on the polishing cloth. Okay, he repeated. There was something in the repetition she couldn't identify. Not amusement. Not surprise. Something else. He left. She heard his footsteps cross the foyer and descend toward the lower wing, unhurried, and then the house was quiet again. She noticed, walking back to the utility closet at noon, that the car she'd seen parked on the residential street below the estate's east-facing windows for the last 3 weeks was gone. She had not known she was keeping track of it until it wasn't there. The replacement for Giulia Ferraro was not vetted quickly. In the 6 days that followed, Rosa Vega managed the household inventory, the staff schedule, the Tuesday and Thursday kitchen logistics, and her own East Wing duties simultaneously, and she did not complain about this because she was making time and a half for the additional responsibilities, and the surgery was in 3 days, and then 2 days, and then 1 day, and then it was the 23rd. She had asked for the day. Marco Conti had approved it through a text message that read, of course, "Update me when you know the outcome." She had stared at that for a long time. Diego's surgery lasted 6 hours and 14 minutes, according to the clock on the waiting room wall that Rosa watched, with the particular focus of someone who has decided that keeping track of exact numbers is the same as maintaining control over something. The surgeon came out at 4:40 with the particular walk of someone who has good news but has learned to deliver it carefully. And Rosa Vega sat in a plastic waiting room chair and cried into her jacket sleeve for approximately 90 seconds, and then stopped and texted Marco Conti, "He's okay." The response came in 40 seconds. "Good." And then, 11 seconds later, "Go home. Don't come in tomorrow." She went home. She made tea in the small apartment that had Diego's wooden letters on the bookshelf, because she hadn't gotten around to unpacking the box yet. She sat with the tea and the letters, and the particular quiet of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing for 16 months, and is not yet sure what to do now that the waiting is over. She didn't notice the envelope that had been slid under her apartment door until she stepped on it at 6 in the morning. She almost didn't open it. She put it on the kitchen table and made coffee and stood at the window for 10 minutes, and then picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper from a law firm she'd never heard of, Marchetti and Associates, an address in Century City, stating that the outstanding balance on the account of Rosa Vega and Diego Vega with Cedars-Sinai Medical Center had been settled in full as of the previous afternoon, through a legal mechanism structured as a retroactive housing subsidy administered through a property management entity she had never heard of, which meant it would not appear on her tax return as income. There was a reference number. There was a name at the bottom, the partner who had handled the filing. There was no mention of Marco Conti. She sat down. She sat there for a very long time. When she came into the estate the following Monday, she went directly to his office on the second floor rather than to the utility closet. She knocked once. He said, "Come in." She opened the door and stood in the doorway and looked at him and said, "That wasn't yours to do." He looked up from whatever was on his desk. "It was done. I need to know why." He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she had come to understand, meant he was deciding how much of what he actually thought to say out loud. "You stepped in front of something that wasn't your problem," he said. "In my experience, people who do that are either reckless or they have a specific kind of character. I've watched you for 12 weeks. It wasn't reckless." She didn't say anything. "You've been managing this household for 6 days in addition to your actual position," he said. "And you showed up on the 24th when I told you not to." He paused. "The debt was a practical obstacle to someone who works here. I removed it." "That's not." She stopped. Started again. "You can't just decide things for people." "No," he said. "I decided for me. What you do with it is yours." She stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she said, "Diego's D was always a centimeter lower than the rest of the letters. My father hung them crooked." She didn't know why she said it. It was just the true thing that was in her head. Marco Conti looked at her. "The letters from the box on your bookshelf?" She froze. "How do you? Building security does a welfare check when any employee has a family medical event," he said. "Standard procedure." The report noted the box. I asked what was in it. He paused. "Diego. Pine. Slightly uneven." She left his office without saying anything else, which she recognized, walking down the stairs, was probably not a graceful exit. But she was thinking about the fact that he had asked what was in the box, and that felt important in a way she hadn't finished processing yet. The car came back on a Wednesday. Not the same car, a different one, black where the first had been silver, parked on the residential street below the east-facing windows with 2 wheels on the curb in a way that read as unhurried and permanent. Rosa noticed it because she had noticed the first one's absence, which meant she had been looking. She filed it and kept working, and at noon she saw, through the east wing window, a second car pull onto the street behind the first. She was replacing the linens in the guest room on the third floor when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. You should leave the estate now. Use the service exit. She stood holding the pillowcase and the phone and thought about what kind of person received anonymous texts advising them to leave through the service exit, and whether she was that kind of person now. And then she thought about what kind of person sent them. She put the phone in her pocket and finished the pillowcase and went downstairs through the front staircase, deliberately, and walked into the kitchen where Tom's, the second in command, the one who answered to Marco before anyone else did, the one with the careful hands and the habit of standing near doorways, was on his phone with his back to her. He turned when he heard her. The call ended. You need to go upstairs, he said. There are 2 cars on the street. I know. His voice was steady, deliberate. Marco is handling it. You need to be upstairs. Who sent me a text telling me to use the service exit? Toms looked at her for a long moment. That text was wrong, he said. The service exit is not where you want to be right now. I need you to go to the 3rd floor and stay in the room at the end of the hall with the blue door. And I need you to not open that door until someone with a key does it from the outside. Can you do that? She thought about the surgery, which was over. She thought about Diego, who was in a care facility for another 3 weeks of recovery. She thought about what the wooden letters spelled, and the man who had asked a security officer what was in the box, and the way certain kinds of debt didn't work like money. Okay, she said, and went upstairs. She sat on the floor of the blue room for 47 minutes. She knew because she counted. Not because she was afraid, or not only because she was afraid, but because counting was the same as keeping track, and keeping track was the same as not letting go of the part of herself that made decisions rather than simply enduring them. She thought about the text from the unknown number. She thought about the 2 cars on the street. She thought about Giulia Ferraro, who had been placed on indefinite leave after 12 weeks of building toward a specific kind of cruelty. And she thought about the fact that the cruelty had not been aimed at Rosa at all. Originally, it had been aimed at an old woman with a cane. She thought about what kind of people stood in front of things, and what that cost them, and what it meant when someone noticed. At minute 47, she heard the key in the lock. Marco Conti opened the door and looked at her on the floor, with her back against the wall and her hands in her lap. You went up the front stairs, he said. Yes, I told Toms to send you through the east corridor. He did. I made a different decision. He was looking at her with an expression she had seen once before, in the library, at the baseboard. When she had turned and looked at him and said I wasn't injured, it was my arm. Something being noted, something being filed. The situation is resolved, he said. The men on the street were sent by someone who thought my mother's household staff was an access point. They've been corrected on that assumption. Were they the same men who've been watching the east-facing windows for 3 weeks? He was quiet. You noticed. The first car was gone the morning after I told you about my arm, she said. The second one started 6 days later. He sat down on the floor against the opposite wall. She had not expected this, and she suspected he hadn't planned it, but neither of them stood up. The first car was unrelated to you, he said. The second was a test. Someone wanted to know whether the household staff had been briefed, whether they were valuable. And the text? From the man who sent the cars. He wanted to see if you'd move. I didn't move through the service exit. No, he said. You went up the front staircase. He paused. Why? She thought about this carefully. Because you said the debt removal was practical, she said, and I believed you, which surprised me because I expected something else. And I thought if I believed you about that, then the correct thing to do when someone told me to leave through the service exit was to go to the person I believed instead. He looked at her for a long moment. The house was quiet around them. Not the nervous quiet of the kitchen before his car arrived, but a different kind. One she hadn't heard before. "I've watched you for 12 weeks, he said again, but differently than before. You fold the newspapers so the headlines face up. You put the books back exactly where you found them. Every morning you check the East Wing thermostat at 7:43, and if it's set above 70, you turn it down 1 degree, and then forget to adjust it back." Rosa Vega looked at the man across from her on the floor of the blue room. "You've been counting." "Yes, why?" He was quiet again in the way that meant he was deciding how much of the true thing to say. Then he said, "Because I didn't know why you stepped in front of that slap." "I still don't, completely. But I've been paying attention to the person who did it. And I think she's the kind of person who should know she's being seen." She thought about her brother's name in pine letters, slightly uneven, D a centimeter lower than the rest. She thought about the surgery on the 23rd and the envelope under the door, and the way of course had looked in a text message from a man who ran things through mechanisms that left no visible fingerprints. "I'm going to need to decide some things," she said. "I know. I'm not going to decide them tonight. I know that too." She stood up. He stood up. She opened the door and walked out into the hallway, and he didn't follow her, and she went downstairs and got her coat and drove home to the apartment with the wooden letters on the bookshelf. And she made tea, and she sat with it, and she thought for a long time about what it meant when a person who controlled things chose, instead, to simply pay attention. What happened to Giulia Ferraro was quiet, the way Marco Conti's responses to most things were quiet. The domestic staffing agency received a formal complaint filed through Marchetti and Associates citing the incident, naming Giulia Ferraro specifically, and requesting a permanent flag on her placement record across all domestic service networks in the state. The agency complied, because the letter had the right stationery and the right tone, and because Marco Conti's household had been a client for 14 years, and the agency understood the arithmetic of that without being told. The woman Giulia Ferraro had used as a professional reference for 11 years, a woman who ran 3 private households in Bel Air, received a copy of the complaint documentation, which was the kind of thing that traveled in certain circles. It traveled. Giulia Ferraro's phone became quiet in ways she didn't understand, and the calls she made to references who could have helped her move laterally were not returned, and by the end of the month she understood, without being told directly, that the household staffing world she had operated in for 11 years had been closed to her. The door had not been slammed. It had simply been locked while she was looking the other way. The debt in Rosa Vega's name, $47,000 split between her account and her brother's, accumulated over 16 months, remained settled. The legal mechanism held. The property management entity continued to exist, quietly, in the records of a Century City law firm. Diego Vega was discharged from the care facility on a Thursday, thinner than he'd been before, steadier than Rosa had expected, and he moved into the apartment in Monterey Park with the wooden letters on the bookshelf and said, "The first morning, D is crooked." "I know," Rosa said. "Papa hung it himself." Diego looked at it for a moment. "Don't fix it," he said. She didn't. She went back to the estate on a Monday and told Marco Conti she had decided. He was in the library, not at the desk, but in the chair by the window, the one with a book open face down on the armrest. She could see the page number from where she stood, 47. She did not say anything about this. "I'm not going to pretend I know what your world is," she said. "I've seen parts of it. Men in cars, a room with a blue door, legal mechanisms in Century City. I've watched how people move when you're in a building. She paused. I'm not afraid of it. I want you to understand the difference between not knowing something and being afraid of it. He was watching her with complete attention. I stepped in front of that slap because your mother was standing there with a cane, she said. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what it would cost. I would do it again. She stopped. I think that's what you've been waiting to hear me say. Yes, he said. I'm still going to need to do some things my own way. I know. The newspapers should face up, she said. That's not negotiable. Something happened at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Agreed, he said. She sat down in the chair across from him, not at the desk, not at the professional distance she had maintained for 12 weeks. The afternoon light came through the east, facing windows at the angle that meant it was close to 4 o'clock. She could hear the house around them, not nervous, not careful, just the particular quiet of a place that has resolved into something. What's on page 47? She said. He picked up the book. Read her the line. It was about the kind of love that does not announce itself, that accumulates in small counted things until one day the person doing the counting looks up and finds they have already decided. She looked out the east-facing window at the residential street below. Empty, clean, the kind of afternoon that comes after things are finished. Keep reading, she said. He did. Rosa carried her quiet for 3 years before she understood it wasn't armor, it was just who she was, and Marco Conti had seen that before she named it. Tell me in the comments, when did you first know she wasn't going to leave? Was it the Blue Room or the newspapers? Drop it below. I read every one. If this is the kind of story you come here for, the ones where the quiet ones turn out to be the strongest, where the settling of debts goes both ways, follow along. New story every day. One more thing. Diego knows more about what happened that Tuesday morning in the foyer than his sister has ever told him. He's been waiting for the right moment to ask. The question is whether Rosa will answer it, or whether Marco will.